A tragedy of warfare that is always a direct and purposeful result of military action, causing immense hardship and suffering on civilian populations, and used as leverage for capitulation by opposing forces, is the siege. A siege typically occurs when a strategic city or other similar municipality, which is otherwise too difficult to take in direct combative action, refuses to surrender to attackers. In response, the defending city is surrounded, its supplies such as food, medicine, and clean water cut off to civilians and military forces alike, essentially turning what was once considered a safe haven of security into an open-air prison, devoid of resources, threatening starvation and death on everyone caught within. Since the advent of long-range military weapons like the trebuchet, sieges often come with prolonged bombardment of the city infrastructure in order to terrorize the enemy into submission. A stark example would be the Siege of Leningrad, which took place during World War II when the Soviet Union city was encircled by German and Finnish forces for over 900 days, attributing to the largest loss of life in a modern city, killing more than 1 million people, mostly from starvation. However, the city also endured merciless bombing runs which killed nearly 20,000 people alone and inflicted widespread structural damage to buildings, displacing thousands more. Fortunately, many in the city would escape to air raid shelters, and many others dug trenches to survive such attacks. Other examples of civilian resilience during World War II, when the population had to adapt to survive their city being bombarded, include the people of London, who would spend many nights sleeping in large bomb shelters that once served as subway platforms, as German bombers dropped their munitions on the city from above. Yet another example of people's resolve and adaptiveness to survive when faced with the destruction of their collective community occurred less than 100 years before the Second World War. Taking place in 1863 during the American Civil War, it is a siege some are likely familiar with, the Siege of Vicksburg. One of numerous tumultuous events in the small Mississippi River town's history, and a definitive turning point in the war, it showed how far a civilian population would go to survive an existential threat to their community, such as abandoning the homes they once lived in for an alternative, subterranean life beneath the town Union forces would bomb as gunships ominously moored just off the banks of the churning river. This was the Siege of Vicksburg, a true horror in history. The land upon which Vicksburg would eventually be settled was originally inhabited by several Native American tribes who lived primarily north of the area the city proper would be constructed, in what is now known as Redwood, along the Yazoo River. It is thought that these people may have also encountered the famed Spanish explorer and conquistador, Hernando de Soto, as he and his expeditionary forces first came upon the mighty Mississippi River south of Natchez in 1541, the first Europeans to set eyes on it. By the 18th century, French explorers constructed a fort in 1719 in what is now northern Warren County, the first European settlement in the area. Named Fort St. Pierre, it was the northernmost outpost of the larger French Louisiana territory and was established to thwart English influence as missionaries and traders descended on Mississippi from the Carolinas, having already settled the northern areas of the Mississippi territories while making advances throughout the Yazoo River Valley. By 1790, the Spanish had taken control of the territory, erecting Fort Nogales, translated to walnut trees, the black walnut tree native and abundant in Mississippi. But following the American Revolutionary War and a treaty with Spain, the territory was ceded over to the U.S., and the outpost was renamed Walnut Hills, a prominently named restaurant in the city of Vicksburg today. By 1825, the outpost expanded into a village and was formally incorporated into the United States as Vicksburg, named after the Protestant missionary Newitt Vick, who settled the area with his family in 1812. Mississippi had voted in 1859 to secede from the Union should an abolitionist be elected president. Abraham Lincoln won that election in 1860. They would therefore join the states of the newly formed Confederacy or the Confederate States of America. The CSA then elected Mississippi Representative Jefferson Davis as their president. Davis gave his first official speech as the Confederate president in Vicksburg in February 1861. In this address, he expressed his hope that succession efforts would proceed peacefully, but that if war should arrive, he would be ready to fight. The truth was, most suspected if there were to be a civil war, it would likely not last more than one battle. The reality shocked everyone when Confederate forces routed the Union Army during the first major battle of the war in Virginia, initially expected to be an easy victory for the Union. However, both armies realized a brutal, hard-fought war was in fact in store for the country. The city of Vicksburg would prove to be a vital asset that could lead to a turning point for the side that controlled it. As then President Abraham Lincoln put it, "See what a lot of land these fellows hold, of which Vicksburg is the key. The war can never be brought to a close until that key is in our pocket. We can take all the northern ports of the Confederacy, and they can defy us from Vicksburg." One of the Confederacy's greatest advantages, being located in the southern United States, was the control it had over the largest river in the country. The Mississippi River, as it is today, was a vital commercial route for goods and resources, of which the Confederacy had constructed numerous fortifications and batteries along its banks, stretching north where things such as ammunition and additional Confederate troops could be mobilized to replenish bloody battlefields. However, Ulysses S. Grant, leader of the Union armies and future President of the United States, led his troops south against the Confederates. The deeper into the southern territories he gained, the harder the fighting became. One of the major advantages the Confederacy did have against the outnumbering forces of the Union is that the majority of the Civil War was fought in the South. Territories the Confederates knew inside and out, also holding support of the civilian population, who would bolster their troops' supplies and even conduct espionage missions against the Union Army. With both Union President Lincoln and Confederate President Davis realizing the importance of Vicksburg, Grant's army honed in on the town, beginning with initial bombardment of Vicksburg by Union Navy gunships in the summer of 1862. However, the Navy detachment did not have enough resources or manpower to adequately force the city to surrender. By late spring 1863, General Grant had marched troops across Louisiana, traversing the river south of Vicksburg, while Union gunships endured the city's batteries to moor themselves into position for renewed bombardment, their mortar guns recalibrated to effectively reach city infrastructure, an oversight that contributed to previous siege failures. After crossing the river, Grant's forces spread out over Mississippi as other Federalist Army formations descended from the north, overtaking Confederate forces with their numbers, culminating in the capture of Mississippi's capital, Jackson. Charged with the defense of Vicksburg, Confederate General John C. Pemberton withdrew his troops to the city and dug in. Grant attempted 2 infantry assaults on Vicksburg in May, which failed, due to the city's high bluffs atop which defending troops repelled the attacks. Grant then ordered for the bombardment and siege of Vicksburg to commence. One Mississippi resident during the siege, a civilian woman named Mary Ann Webster Loughborough, would go on to write and publish the most vivid first-hand account of the siege in her memoir, My Cave Life in Vicksburg. Born in Phelps, New York, Mary would wed Kentucky native James Loughborough before the couple settled in St. Louis, Missouri, where they gained sympathy for the South during the war. On the contrary, a few years before the Civil War, some Vicksburg residents had actually voted against secession and voiced Union support, only to find themselves under fire by Union troops during the siege. Mary's husband joined the Confederate Army, she and her young daughter Jean accompanying him to whatever battlefield he received orders to march to. This would take them to Vicksburg in the summer of 1863, where Mary and her daughter took up lodging with local friends. Rumors and speculation swirled through the heavily fortified, yet quiet town, as reports of Union troop movements within the state of Mississippi and across the river in Louisiana came in. A dark tide was turning towards Vicksburg, as Federal gunships once again arrived on the scene, listing in the muddy river currents, putting the city under close observation, while General Grant closed in. A popular place for residents to gather during and leading up to the siege was an elevated piece of land near the river called Sky Parlor Hill. Before the war, Vicksburg was actually quite cosmopolitan, being a port city on a major U.S. river where Chinese silks, Middle Eastern spices, French perfumes, and other sought-after luxury and exotic commodities were free-flowing into the town. With such booming commerce, largely fueled by the cotton trade, northern bankers, merchants, and other business-savvy entrepreneurs came to call the southern city home. Up until around 1862, that is, when it was clear Vicksburg was a Confederate stronghold, the northern residents evacuating, leaving the population depleted. But up on Sky Parlor Hill, these eclectic residents would once meet for lamplit dinner parties, where they could enjoy each other's company, while being treated to the panoramic views of the city below, along with the sights of the starry night sky above. So while the siege would end such casual endeavors, it did not stop curious eyes from glimpsing the deadly Union ships anchored just upriver, from the heights of the prominent hill. And then the shelling began. The munition the Union ships hurled down upon the city were large, 200-pound shells that exploded mid-air, raining heavy and hot fragments over the streets and buildings, crashing through infrastructure. Contemporary accounts reveal it was like living under a constant hail of metal. One witness detailed a shell coming in through their roof, before smashing through the dining room table, and then collapsing through the floor, creating a large hole which dragged down the table, along with all of the provisions they had gathered to sustain them through the siege. Because of this, and the fact that most homes in Vicksburg did not have basements, the residents took to digging earthen bunkers in and around the city for protection. But this was not quite a new practice. During the limited shelling in 1862, the Union's first attempts at capturing Vicksburg, some took to digging shallow caves in the sides of the bluffs and hills that stretched across the river's banks. However, the bombardment of Vicksburg in 1863 would reach a whole new level of danger. Day and night, the gunships would lob their munitions over the town, while in-place batteries on the opposite side of the river would do their best to hit their targets, all efforts indiscriminately targeting the city's infrastructure and Confederate entrenchments. Even churchgoers were not safe, many believing a religious site would not be targeted, but due to the shell's inaccuracy, shell fragments even made their way over the town church, one account detailing a Sunday sermon being given as a shell exploded outside. The preacher looked up from his teachings and was surprised to see that most of his congregation had fled. The caves below the city became the people's best hope for survival. Most were simple dugouts that spanned several feet or more into the earth, with just enough space for sleeping quarters and a dining area. Others were much more simple, with just enough earth removed to create an awning over its inhabitants. Residents tended to venture out during the day, inspecting the damages to their houses, or finding what little food they could in the market area with difficulty, as rationing had become commonplace for both the army and civilians, with those hoarding supplies price gouging goods. A pound of wheat flour, for example, could be purchased for a staggering $200. Bacon and cornbread became a common meal of the besieged. The Confederate soldiers fighting on the front lines would have it worse, reduced to primarily consuming what could be made from a gritty pea flour, though there were special occasions when a mule or a horse could be butchered, or better yet, some allotment of beef could be procured, such bounties being divvied out to soldiers' families back in town. Towards the end of the siege, things became much more dire. Mary Loughborough's daughter, for example, was given a small bird by a Confederate soldier to comfort her. But with the child starving, one of Mary's servants suggested cooking the bird for her daughter, which she did. For water, many were forced into drinking from muddy puddles on the ground, or drinking water directly from the river, contributing to widespread disease that was exacerbated by lack of medicine due to supply lines being cut off. For others who were lucky, like Mary, who had access to a nearby cistern, clean water was easier to come by. For others, they would find that a pleasant stump tea would steep from tree trunks filled with rainwater. Life in the dirt caves was never easy, especially during the hot and humid deep south summer. Mosquitoes were ever present, along with venomous water snakes that would seek refuge in the caves, along with Vicksburg's residents. But many would go above and beyond to make their caves feel like home, carving out multiple rooms and in some cases, fully furnishing their new earthen abodes. A number of men, including black slaves, found a lucrative business in custom-built caves for those willing to pay. Both the gentry and their enslaved servants would shelter and live together in the caves, Mary often referring to one of her servants, named George, who would many times perform acts of bravery, dashing out of the cave to collect water and other commodities under a hail of minie-ball shot and mortar shells alike. But the caves did not offer the sort of protection they otherwise appeared to. One account in Mary's book mentions a nearby family's cave that suffered a direct hit by a shell, collapsing the roof and burying a young girl alive. The groans and wailings of the girl's family enough to keep anyone awake at night. So even as people sat within their caves as the shells burst overhead, each passing moment could be their last, should a shell find its mark over their earthen bunker. Day and night, week by week, the Confederates would battle the Union along the banks of the river and in the trenches surrounding the city, the gunships moored in the water perpetually bombarding the Confederates and civilians alike for a total of 47 days in an attempt to force the Confederate defenders into capitulation. For much of the siege, Vicksburg believed that they would be receiving reinforcements at the behest of General John C. Pemberton, a 48-year-old Pennsylvania native with a long previous military career prior to the Siege of Vicksburg, having fought in the Mexican-American War, along with participating in military engagements with the Seminole Native Americans in Florida during hostilities. Pemberton had hoped to rally up with General Joseph E. Johnston's forces in Jackson during the month of May in order to bolster his forces for the defense of Vicksburg against Grant's larger army. But as he and a detachment of troops headed east across Mississippi, General Johnston changed the meeting location. Pemberton decided to turn his forces around instead to secure Vicksburg, when he ran straight into Grant's army, sparking the Battle of Champion Hill. Pemberton and his Army of Mississippi were beaten back to Vicksburg, suffering heavy losses and abandoning Haynes' Bluff to the Union, high ground that would allow Union forces an advantage in capturing the city. General Johnston would affirm his contentions against Confederate President Davis's own that Vicksburg was not worth the fight. The city would have to make do with Pemberton's tattered yet tested army. On June 25th, a tremendous explosion was heard just to the east of the city. Located in what today is the Vicksburg National Military Park, the 3rd Louisiana Redan had for weeks held out against Union incursions. However, following the efforts of Union sappers, tunnels were dug beneath the Redan, and over 2,000 pounds of black powder was detonated, sending up a massive column of fire, smoke, dust, and debris, leaving a 40-foot wide crater and punching a hole in Confederate defenses. Union and Confederate soldiers immediately poured into the crater, clashing in a bloody medieval melee, resorting to bayonets and sabers to combat their opponents. However, the Confederates were able to hold the line, and Union troops withdrew, Pemberton's soldiers almost immediately reconstructing the Redan. But this chaotic development in the siege was a signifying omen in the tide of battle, and on July 4th, 1863, General Pemberton raised the white flag of surrender over Vicksburg. His army starved, and the city's population no better off. The siege was over. Following the siege and ensuing battles in and around Vicksburg, statistics point to roughly 800 soldiers killed on both the Confederate and Union sides, with nearly 4,000 Union troops and nearly 3,000 Confederates wounded. Following Pemberton's surrender, over 29,000 Confederate troops were taken prisoner. As for the civilian population of Vicksburg, rattled and malnourished from a summer of bombardment, the casualties were relatively low, with some estimates placing around a dozen Vicksburg residents killed from falling shrapnel. And because of the Union mortar's inaccuracy and the shells largely being of the airburst variety, damage to the city's infrastructure was largely minimal. To this day, you can still tour the historic downtown Vicksburg, where preserved antebellum homes are open to the public, featuring shell fragments still embedded in the structure, out on display for visitors to see. With Vicksburg's surrender, Grant immediately moved his army into its streets and began to distribute food and aid to the people, and Vicksburg was put under martial law by the federal government. The key to the South would become the experimental model for how Reconstruction in the South would proceed. While some residents were just happy to see the stars and stripes waving from flagpoles in their town again, others were embittered over the defeat and the federal agents taking over their local government. Vicksburg would remain under martial law for over 10 years until 1877, even after Mississippi was readmitted into the United States in 1870. Because of this, and the unfortunate date of July 4th being that of the city's surrender, Vicksburg, Mississippi would not officially celebrate July 4th again until the Allies' victory during World War II caused the U.S. to be overcome with patriotism, Vicksburg included, as they celebrated the holiday with the rest of the country, over 80 years since the Civil War and the city's capture. As for Mary Lockborough, she was able to return with her family to their home in Missouri, where she was encouraged by friends to publish her writings of living in Vicksburg's caves during the siege. Her book, My Cave Life in Vicksburg, became a success and is to this day thought of as the most comprehensive account of civilian life during the siege. She would go on to become quite the local literary figure, contributing her voice and writings to multiple publications. But perhaps her most stirring accomplishment was her shared experiences of the terrors and hardships she and other helpless civilians faced when their fellow countrymen placed them at the business end of very large guns, as their country splintered to pieces around them, making the Siege of Vicksburg a true horror in history. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more, please consider subscribing today. And if you have any shocking or scary stories you would like to see covered on the channel, feel free to let us know in the comments below. Thanks for watching Horrors in History.